Hey, welcome to the first episode of the John series of the Daily Scripture Initiative. Today we'll be getting a brief introduction to the Gospel of John, its author, its time and date when it was written, as well as themes, purpose, and background. So hang on tight, let's get into it. The Gospel of John is the fourth book of the New Testament and the fourth Gospel. It's very different from the other three, which those three are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they are termed the Synoptic Gospels. If you put them side by side, they would be very similar chronological events and almost in some ways verbatim from one gospel to the other. However, John takes a different walk through the ministry of Jesus Christ and is much more focused on teachings of Jesus, the doctrine of Jesus, and focuses largely on the ministry of Jesus in and around Jerusalem. Now, because of that, John has been termed the spiritual gospel. The name of the book is the Gospel of John. But is there any other proof that we have that the Apostle John actually wrote this book down for us to read? There are a number of ways that we can look at proving authorship. The first is internal evidence. We know that whoever wrote this book in chapter 1, verse 14, identified himself as someone who witnessed the glory of Jesus. So he was an apostle. He was there when Jesus was transfigured, and he saw the glory, the true glory of Jesus. We also know that in chapter 13, verse 23, the author of this book identifies as one whom Jesus loved, a close disciple of Jesus. Now, we know throughout the gospel that this author mentions Peter and James by name in different ways. However, John is really the only disciple that he doesn't mention by name. And so we draw the conclusion that John is the one who authored this book. There is also external evidence that points to Apostle John being the author of this book, and namely that this fact was accepted universally by all early church fathers. Even as early as AD 110, we have church leaders quoting the Gospel of John, and by 180, there's specific mentions of John writing it and where he wrote it and at what time, what year he did that. We'll get into that in a bit later. There are challenges to the fact that John wrote this gospel, and mainly they are textual criticisms. So they look at the text and they ask questions about, would John actually write this way? Now, there's a bit of an inherent problem with that because we don't have John to ask, why did you write it this way? Although there are some historical contexts that we'll look at later that can direct us one way or another. Mainly, the critics say that because the Gospel of John is so different from the Synoptic Gospels, that it could not have been written by one of Jesus' disciples. It is out of order, its theological progression is so advanced, it would not have been as early as some people say that John lived to write it, and it's more mystical, the doctrine is overdeveloped for that period. That's their critiques of saying that John wrote the book. However, we know that the Apostle John had a different purpose, a different context, and a different audience that he was writing to than the other three Gospels. And so it would very clearly create a different type of reading and a different feel in terms of the content. Plus, we have the fact that early church fathers, even as early as Ignatius in AD 110, accepted John's authorship as a fact. That could be as little as 15 years after the book was actually written. Also, Irenaeus in AD 180 wrote this: John, the disciple of the Lord, who also had leaned upon his breast. Now that's a reference to John chapter 13, verse 13. Did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. So almost immediately, within 15 years of this book being written, people were quoting it, they were saying John was the author, and had a huge acceptance all across the Christian leadership and Christian world that this was authored by John. So we can confidently accept that John is truly the author of this gospel. Now, John, it's important to know that he spent 3 years constantly traveling with Jesus, spending time with him nonstop, picking up on Jesus's teachings and his experiences, and knowing his character and wisdom that like no one else really could. John was part of the inner apostolic circle with James and Peter, which gave him experiences that almost no one else shared. Even those 9 other disciples didn't have the same experiences that these 3 guys had. And the book of John gives specific insight into those types of situations and experiences where those 3 guys were with Jesus alone. So that is a bit about the authorship of the Gospel of John. As previously mentioned, Irenaeus said that this gospel was written in Ephesus. It's also well accepted that John lived in that city later on in his life. He lived to be quite an elderly man, and Ephesus seems to be the place where he lived out his elderly life. However, it is clear that the message of the gospel transcends place and time. Although Ephesus was a great place to write this, as was a city that was the center of trade and culture in that region of the Roman Empire, and was one of the most important urban centers for the Roman Empire. And the letter, the gospel, could be distributed from that place very easily and get around to the Christian churches in many different cities quite easily. The date for John writing this gospel is about 80, 85 to 95, and there isn't really anything we can point to narrow that window down even more. But we don't necessarily need to get it right down to the year or the day, because we know who authored it. We know that it must have been written after the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in AD 70, but obviously it must have been written before the end of John's life in 99 or 100 AD. There's a couple of key references that give this window of time some real clout. The first is, the Sea of Galilee, mentioned all throughout the Gospels and Acts. We know where that is based on our Bible maps. But actually in the second half of that first century, the Sea of Galilee, especially outside of Israel, was called the Sea of Tiberias. And in fact, that's exactly what John calls that sea in his gospel. He calls it the Sea of Tiberias. And so it fits very well within that second half of the first century. Another clue of the timing of the authorship, of the writing of this gospel, is that the author clearly had some idea of how Peter died. In AD 64, 66, in that window, the Apostle Peter was killed as a martyr, and the author of this gospel clearly had that in mind when he wrote this gospel. Finally, the third point is that the Sadducees are not mentioned at all in the Gospel of John. Now, if it was written earlier on, that would be odd that Sadducees weren't mentioned. However, when Jerusalem fell and the temple was destroyed, that's when the Sadducees were scattered, and they really didn't exist after 70 AD. And so the fact that the author of this gospel doesn't mention them at all makes sense for the later date in the second half of the first century. The Gospel of John has been called the spiritual gospel because it's so different from the other three Gospels. The Gospel of John is not a biography going through the life of Jesus, and it's not even a chronological report of the events that were going on. John's purpose was to present Jesus as the Messiah, the spiritually anointed leader that God prophesied all throughout the Old Testament. The purpose of this gospel is clearly stated in chapter 20, verse 31, which says, "These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." John wanted people to know and believe that Jesus is the one God promised, and that is only through him that anyone can find true life. It's a truly evangelistic message, even more than in the other Gospels. As far as the audience and why he wrote these things the way he did, it is clear that John had a few things in mind. First off, he wanted to encourage people with the truth of who Jesus was and what he does for anyone who believes in him. He also knew some of his readers were Jewish. And he presented Jesus as the Messiah, as the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecy, Old Testament ideas. Jesus is that fulfillment. But not only that, John also knew that some of his readers were not Jewish. And so he explained Jewish customs, and he went into detail with Palestinian geography, which for people that were living right there and knew all about it, would probably feel a bit overkill. Like I mentioned earlier, the Sea of Tiberias instead of the Sea of Galilee, connecting with the non-Jewish crowd. And third, he truly knew that some of his readers would not speak Hebrew at all, but are only Greek speakers. And so he translated the Aramaic sayings into Greek. When he quotes people speaking Aramaic, he then translates that into Greek for his Greek readers. The Gospel of John was written for a different purpose than the other Gospels, and looks and feels quite different as a result. However, we can affirm that the Apostle John did write this book, and for many people to read. Not just Jews, not just Ephesians, not just ancient Christians, but this book transcends all places and all time, and it applies and is meant for you and for me. John, a man who spent 3 years as one of Jesus' closest companions, wrote this book to encourage your faith in Jesus and encourage you that you can experience the true life through him. Well, let's get into the Word and let's dig into the Gospel of John.